I'm John Batchelor. Gordon Chang, my colleague and co-host, is here, and we begin with a news report of a character named Guccifer, real name Marcel Lazare Lahel. He's born in 1973. He's now in the custody of the United States government, federal authorities. I believe he's in the state of Virginia. Why? Because he broke into the homebrew server for Mrs. Clinton, now at the center of an FBI investigation. We'll have more of that later in the show, but I use Guccifer as an example of the fact that there is no such thing as a benign hack, that hacks are threats to the security and the safety and the prosperity of the American people. And they're unsolved. And I know this because our first guest this evening is Bill Gertz, senior editor of the Washington Free Beacon, writing about hacking and the Obama administration's cybersecurity, cyber espionage, cyber terror, the Obama administration's so far incomplete response. Bill, I'm being diplomatic. A very good evening to you. Guccifer claims he was not an enemy of the United States. He was just fooling around. But we never really know, do we? The assumption, it can never be solved as to why someone's hacking into us. Does the Obama administration take all this seriously, or did they just read the Washington Free Beacon and move on? Good evening to you.
Good evening. Thanks for having me on the show. The problem is that the internet and cyberspace is a relatively lawless environment. You know, when someone tries to manipulate our currency, we have laws for that. If someone violates a contract, we have laws that can deal with that. There isn't a place you can take somebody like Guccifer, who hacked into the Secretary of State's private email server, and do something. I mean, we're at the early stages of developing norms and ultimately laws and legal action. It's a very, very gray area. The administration has not done enough to counteract some of these massive hacking attacks, especially from China. Last year we had the Anthem healthcare attack, which stole 80 million records of Americans. Then we had the Office of Personnel Management attack, which was a devastating over 22 million of very sensitive personnel records, which have been stolen. And they weren't just stolen, they're actually being used for counterintelligence and further cyber operations by the Chinese.
So, Bill, why doesn't the U.S. do more? So, for instance, we know that U.S. companies have been attacked by the Chinese and by others, and yet U.S. companies are not permitted to hack back, as it's called. In other words, to go after those who've taken their data and erase it or do something so that it can't be taken advantage of. And at the same time that the federal government prevents companies from protecting themselves, what is the U.S. government doing? It's doing nothing. I mean, why is this sort of situation going on?
Well, we're in the middle of a debate right now. There's a segment of the national security community, the intelligence agencies, some in the Pentagon, some in the Justice Department, who say, look, we've got to show a demonstration of cyber force, otherwise there will be no deterrent. The way the Cyber Command commander put it, that's Admiral Mike Rogers, was that the cost of entry into this field of hacking is so low that it's so attractive for people. When you raise the cost, when you make it more difficult. Now, the White House doesn't want to do that, and I quoted from former Defense Secretary and CIA Director Leon Panetta in the piece you mentioned, where he was saying that the White House has basically short-circuited the entire constitutional government system. They've concentrated power in the National Security Council staff and a few key aides like Ben Rhodes, and their thing is don't do anything because it could cause a conflict. So in the case of China, they were literally going to impose sanctions, and because the Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, last September made some basically feckless promise that he wouldn't do economic espionage, they backed off the sanctions. And that just, again, is just encouraging more of these cyber attacks.
You know, talking about the cyber attacks, and we don't want to provoke war in cyberspace, you got to remember that the chief U.S. counterintelligence official, William Ivana, or whatever his name is, has said that the U.S. each year loses $400 billion worth of intellectual property. These are U.S. companies, and that about 90% of the attacks come from China. So I have 400 billion reasons why we're already deep into cyber conflict, but we're not doing anything.
Yeah, it's definitely time for a reevaluation. I would hope that something like this would be a topic during the presidential campaign that's coming up, but so far we haven't seen it. It hasn't really kind of risen to the level of a national debate. It definitely needs to be part of a national debate.
Most recently, there was news about bad actors, I believe they were Iranian, hacking into an actual hydroelectric facility in Westchester County, just north of here, Rye, New York, which struck me as bizarre and a little off target, but in any event, it was suggestive of the fact that all systems are vulnerable to hacking. The puzzle for me, Bill, is what do we do about it when we catch somebody? What is an adequate response to a bad actor whom we have reason to believe is connected to a GPS address of a capital of an enemy state?
Two things. First of all, the infrastructure hacking that you mentioned about this New York dam, this highlights what I would call an extreme vulnerability. These industrial systems that we have are much different than the information technology systems that you would normally have with a laptop computer or a desktop. These are old systems that are operational technology, and they're all extremely vulnerable. They have weak points. It's very easy for hackers to get in there. So the first step is we've got to strengthen and modernize the infrastructure networks that basically do remote control for these industrial systems. That's the first thing. The second thing is they've got to make it clear that there's a cost. If it's a legal cost, somebody who violates the law by hacking and domestically, you prosecute them. If it's someone overseas, then they should consider doing some type of counter cyber attack, either to take back the information that was stolen or to somehow disable the perpetrators' networks and systems.
And you know what we did in that case you talked about, John, with the dam at Rye Brook, New York? We indicted 7 Iranians. Now, that's his first step, of course, but, those Iranians are not going to come into federal district court and say, oh, please try me. And by the way, it was not just the dam that those guys went after. They went after money center banks. They went J.P. Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, and about 8 other companies. This is the financial infrastructure for the United States, because that's the heart of the financial system, John.
What's your measure, Bill? Does the American electorate take all this seriously, or do we all regard it as like a lost iPhone?
I think it's still in the early stages. People when it starts to affect people more directly, and I think last year, anybody that worked for the federal government and got a letter from OPM saying, gee, we're very sorry, but, your information was hacked. I think when that begins, and Anthem did the same thing. I got a letter from Anthem saying, we're not sure, but just to make sure, we may have compromised your health care records. When that starts affecting people on a personal level, I think then you will hear more pushback and greater debate on someone taking action, the government side or even the private sector, letting them have a whack at trying to counteract some of these foreign hackers.
Puzzle also. We lost Verizon service for a few hours in New York City, and I'm told in the Hudson River Valley. And there was immediately not idle thought that it was hackers. We wouldn't know, would we, Bill? I mean, we could all guess, but we're so cynical these days, we could believe that the information was not going to be passed on to us because it was a national security matter, or maybe Verizon just didn't want to say they were vulnerable.
It's a lot of times, if there was an attack and the attacker is a sophisticated actor like the Russians or the Chinese, the fact of the matter is we might not know that. It might be done in such a way as to mask the origin of the attack. They can make it look like it was some type of internal breakdown or some type of computer overload in certain areas. But the fact, and of course the companies are very conscious about not revealing too many details about that because they're very worried about the bottom line in protecting their reputation.
I just got an email from Verizon. It wasn't us. It was Time Warner. I correct myself. Sorry, Verizon. Verizon customer service is the seventh most powerful person in the solar system, so I don't want to mess with Verizon customer service. Bill Gertz of the Washington Free Beacon, writing about what we know right now about the inadequate response to cyber terror. Gordon Chang of the Daily Beast. I'm John Batchelor.